The acknowledged world leaders in post-war sports car styling were the Italians. This is a 1947 Ferrari. Italian cars fired the imagination of young Jerry Coker, who with no experience had the cheek to suggest modifications to some of Healey's earlier designs. Jerry was given the job of styling the new car.
I knew what I wanted, being a very ardent admirer of Italian cars, so it was up to me to convince him as to what he wanted, and that's the way we did it.
While Jerry Coker worked on the body styling, the Healeys tested the engine, chassis, and running gear. Steering and front suspension components also came from the Austin Company. The car was to be released at the 1952 Earl's Court Motor Show. Coker's design was a sleek, handsome two-seater, as low as possible given the height of the engine. But Donald Healey was a hard man to please. There was an argument about a character line in the rear bodywork.
I'd show him this character line and he'd say, well, why don't you take it right through? And my answer to that would be that, well, you don't have a line finishing at an opening and then picking up 2 feet later. As far as I'm saying, it either finishes there or we don't have it. Oh, all right, that's it. Do you agree? That's it. That's the way it is. You know, we're either purists or we're not. So we were somewhat purists. Donald decided that he didn't like the front end. The grille was a squashed version of his early Healeys, and I'd spread it a bit wider, but really I didn't like it either. And he said, Jerry, I'm sorry, I know you put a lot of work into this, but I can't enter that in the Earl's Court show. I just don't like the grille. So I said, well, if I could change the grille, will you give me time to change that design of that grille? I'll make it a bit lower, the top, and wider, which is what it needs. We'll have to get away from your original grille. So he said, oh, all right. And so I did that. Took the grille off, and we changed the sheet metal bit on the front of the car, and made a new grille. And this is the grille that it finished up in the show with, this type of grille.
There was a certain amount of embarrassment because Nash Motors were paying for the stand, paying the expenses of the show, and but they did agree that we could show our own cars, and my father wasn't happy with the front end and thought the rear end view was the better view of the car, so he parked it with its nose up against this pillar. And, you know, it was just that he wasn't completely satisfied. He was a very difficult man to satisfy.
Well, after the journalists got at him, and this is about the biggest compliment I had, he told me, one of them asked him who the Italian was that designed the car. So he said, oh, just a country lad works for me, or something like that. So he was forced to drag the thing out and put up ropes so that people couldn't get to the car. So that was quite exciting, really.
One of the people most excited by the new car was Len Lord, now head of the giant new British Motor Corporation, a powerful combination of the large Austin and Nuffield car companies.
Now, Austin knew exactly what we were doing because they had agreed to supply the units, and when Len Lord saw it in the light of day at the show, he really immediately realized its potential, and he went along to my father and said, look, you can make a few of these cars a year and you'll make a little money and you'll have a good time, but he said the real thing is you don't want to bother with manufacturing motor cars. We're the experts, let us do it. We'll come to an agreement. And he and Len Lord agreed there and then on the spot on some sort of agreement for Austin to manufacture the car.
Donald Healey had planned to hand-build his new car at Warwick, but Len Lord, with the resources of the vast British Motor Corporation behind him, intended to mass-produce 200 cars a week. Another part of the deal with BMC was that the name of the car be changed to Austin-Healey. It now became the Austin-Healey 100-4, the number 100 meaning it was capable of 100 miles an hour, and the 4 relating to the 4 cylinders of the Austin engine. Full-scale assembly was planned to start in the summer of 1953. The bodies would be manufactured by the Jensen Company. The other components would come from the BMC production line. Healey didn't know it at the time, but he'd made a deal that would ultimately crush his dream car under the weight of a vast organization. It was planned that final assembly of the Austin-Healeys would take place at the Austin Longbridge factory. Before full-scale BMC production began, the Healey factory at Warwick produced 20 pre-production cars to be used for promotion. At the 1953 International Motor Sports Show in New York, the Austin-Healey was awarded the title International Motor Show Car of 1953. Special test cars were also built. They were designed for competition and had light alloy body panels. The original Healey design was slightly modified. The height of the headlamps was raised, the steering was changed, and larger brake drums were installed. Because of the high torque of the A90 engine, first gear was blocked off, so the gearbox became a 3-speed unit with overdrive on second and third. The price of the new production version of the car was £1,063. From the point of view of passenger comfort, the Austin-Healey was not at its best in the rain. At high speed, the soft top would leak, and visibility through the side curtains was poor. It was a car built for driving with the top down.
This folding windshield, I think the car should never be photographed with the windshield up, because without this windshield, the car's nothing as far as I'm concerned, whether it's any good or not. And it isn't a one-man job to put in position. Yeah. There we are. Still works after 40 years.
Donald Healey's deal with Len Lord and BMC didn't mean that he'd completely surrendered his baby to mass production. The Healey factory at Warwick concentrated on developing the car for competition, and modifications were fed back into the cars that came off the production line at Longbridge. The BN1, the first version of the car, was produced until August 1955. The BN2, which followed, showed the influence of corporate thinking. The Austin rear axle was replaced by a Morris unit, a piece of BMC rationalization. The main change between models was that the BN2 had a 4-speed gearbox with overdrive on third and fourth. The 100M was a modified version of the BN2 for discerning buyers. Standard cars were taken off the production line at Longbridge and delivered to the Cape factory at Warwick for modification. Engine output was increased to 110 horsepower, and the suspension was improved to give better handling. In the first 2 years of Austin-Healey development, Donald and Jeff Healey spent a great deal of time in the USA, working on ultra-high performance versions of the basic car. In 1953, Donald drove a modified 100 over a flying mile at 142 miles an hour. In 1954, he attempted to drive a streamlined and supercharged version at 200 miles an hour over a flying kilometer. He failed. The best he could achieve in this extreme development of his sports car with a futuristic body designed by Jerry Coker was 193 miles an hour. The Healey team was also involved in road racing. At Sebring in 1954, a special test 100 achieved third place. This success led to the production of a superb limited edition Healey, the 100S. Only the chassis of this car was stock. The special light alloy body was produced by the Jensen Company. The car was only available in this blue and white two-tone finish. The power output was far greater than the normal road car. An alloy Westlake cylinder head boosted the standard car's output of 90 horsepower to 132. Greater power output called for greater stopping power, and the 100S had Dunlop disc brakes on all four wheels. The original Healey grille, which Donald Healey and Jerry Coker had argued about, was replaced by an oval-shaped version. There was great rivalry within BMC between the Austin-Healey and MG divisions. In 1955, the new modern-styled MGA replaced the old-fashioned T-Series MG sports cars. The MGA was virtually a 1.5-litre version of the Austin-Healey. The same year, BMC produced a 6-cylinder, 2.6-litre engine. BMC told the Healey family that it planned to discontinue the 4-cylinder engine and announced the production of a new 6-cylinder version of the Austin-Healey. The Healey family didn't agree with the change, but there was little they could do about it. In fact, the 4-cylinder engine was not discontinued. It went on for years, powering London taxicabs. BMC considered that the buying public was ready for an Austin-Healey with more creature comforts than the out-and-out sports 104. The Long Ridge line was modified to produce a car that was rather easier to manage than its predecessor. When the Austin-Healey 106 emerged from the Long Ridge factory, it looked generally similar to Donald Healey's original car. The most obvious difference was the oval radiator derived from the 100S. The 6-cylinder engine was more powerful, but the car was longer and heavier, so there was little change in performance. Because the engine was smoother, it was easier for a non-expert to drive. The great sales success of Austin-Healey had come from the American market. More were sold in California than anywhere else. With the introduction of the 6-cylinder version, BMC's eyes were more firmly fixed than ever across the Atlantic. In 1959, the 106 was replaced by the Austin-Healey 3000. The new engine was a bored-out version of the original 6, developing 124 horsepower. It had front disc brakes and a top speed of 114 miles an hour. The cars could now accommodate 4 people, just. In 1957, there had been a great change in BMC sports car production. Assembly of the big Healeys and the Austin-Healey Sprite was moved to the MG factory at Abingdon. The sports cars that flowed from this factory in the late 50s and early 60s were among Britain's greatest earners of export dollars. The Sprite was originally a product of the Healey factory at Warwick. It was a response to Len Lord's request for a smaller, cheaper sports car. By the early 60s, it had changed from its original frog eye form, but was still finding ready acceptance in the American market. Market forces meant that the development of the big Healeys and the Sprite tended to minimize their character as pure sports cars and make them more acceptable to mass buyers. The windscreen you could lay down flat had long since disappeared. And then in 1962 came the ultimate insult to the sports car purist. The Austin-Healey 3000 was fitted with wind-up windows. For all their development, the big Healeys were, by the early 60s, old-fashioned cars. Much of BMC's design genius was concentrated on a genuinely revolutionary small family sedan. It appeared in 1962. It was the legendary Mini.